in the next example, we're being asked to draw the graphs of the cosine and the sine function. So let's remember what those values are, and we're going to label all the zeros and the maxima and the minima of these functions. So let me set up some axes here. And I'm going to label my x-axis in terms of multiples of pi. And the reason I'm going to do that is because we're talking about cosines and sines of multiples of pi. So we're really talking about radians here. So that's pi, that's 2 pi, that's pi over 2, and that's 3 pi over 2. That's 0, of course. The y-axis I'm going to label as 1 and -1. And I've set up my scale here. Remember that pi is about 3.14, so it's a little bit bigger than 3. So I've set up my scale here so that the pi is about a little bit beyond 3 units on the graph. I'll extend it a little bit on the left here as well. So we've got negative pi, I draw that around -3, and negative pi over 2. And now I want to graph the sine and cosine function according to those values that we figured out. Remember that the sine and cosine function correspond to coordinates of angles on the unit circle. So sine and cosine, remember, are the x and y coordinates of angles on the unit circle. Now, those coordinates will never get bigger than 1 or smaller than -1. So that's why on my y-axis I only went up to -1 and 1, because the coordinates will never get bigger than -1 and 1. So let me start out with the cosine function. I'll do that one in blue. Y equals cosine x. So we'll remember the values that we learned in the previous question. Cosine x, cosine of 0 is 1. Cosine of pi over 2 was 0. Cosine of pi is -1. Cosine of 3 pi over 2 is 0. And cosine of 2 pi is up at 1 again. And so what you get is this smooth curve and after 2 pi, remember, after you circle 2 pi radians, then everything starts repeating. So what happens after 2 pi is that it repeats itself. And it repeats itself in the negative direction as well. And so now we know what the graph of cosine x looks like. I'll do the sine graph in red. And remember that sine of 0 is 0. Sine of pi over 2 is 1. Sine of pi was 0 again. Sine of 3 pi over 2 was -1. Sine of 2 pi is 0. I'm doing these from memory, and hopefully you remember these values as well. But if you ever can't remember these values, you know you can always look back at the unit circle and figure them out again just from their coordinates. So the sine graph, I'm going to connect these up into a smooth curve. And it repeats itself after this. And it repeats in the negative direction as well. So that's what y equals sine x looks like. It actually has the same shape as cosine x, but it's shifted over on the graph. Now we're asked to label all zeros and maxima and minima. Let me go through and label the zeros first. this is, on the cosine x, this is pi over 2, 0. That's a 0 right there. There's one right there, 3 pi over 2, 0. And this one, even though I haven't labeled it on the x-axis, is actually 5 pi over 2, 0, because it's pi over 2 beyond 2 pi. Negative pi over 2, 0. So those are the zeros of the cosine graph. The maxima, the high points, remember cosine and sine never get bigger than 1 or less than negative 1. So anytime it actually hits 1, it's a maximum. So there are the two maxima at 0 and 2 pi. The minimum value is negative 1. So there's pi negative 1. And the next one would be at 3 pi negative 1. There's one at negative pi negative 1. And now let me do the zeros of the sine graph. There's one, 0, 0. Negative pi 0. And pi 0. 2 pi 0. The maximum value would be 1, and that occurs at pi over 2. And again at 5 pi over 2. And the minimum value would be at 3 pi over 2, where the sine is negative 1. Remember, sine and cosine never go outside that range, negative 1 to 1. And at negative pi over 2. So all of these values you should pretty much have memorized. They're the sort of simplest values, the easiest ones to figure out of sine and cosine.